Good evening, everyone. We're looking at the issue of forgiveness. We're continuing our deep dive into that topic because it is so important to ensure we get that right if we are to heal properly. We're looking at a different perspective, and I think actually the correct perspective. A lot of people have been told to forgive and forget, move on, bury the hatchet. In fact, we've looked at a meme that has said, bring it up now. I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who was not sorry and accept an apology I never received. Well, is that correct? Should we do that? We're going to look at that in depth again. If you've been with us, you will actually know the answer, but we're going into that even further to help clarify. Are there categories of people that have been negatively impacting you that you do not have to forgive and therefore do not have to be saddled with false guilt? We will look at that next on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome to Journey to Healing. Do you find yourself discouraged, troubled, in need of healing, but not sure where to turn? Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor, is here to help. Jon has more than 25 years of professional experience helping people deal with the issues that keep them emotionally and spiritually stuck. There is help. There is hope. There is a God who loves you and wants to help you find peace and strength. And Jon Uhler is here to help you find that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. We are in the midst of a series on forgiveness that stems out of a series on boundaries. And within our series on forgiveness, we had a question submitted that we're still unpacking. And it had to do with, well, what about when Jesus said, love your enemies? And that was an important question because that really is part of, and it's tied in with, of course, the issue of forgiveness. And we've been looking at what exactly did Jesus mean by that? I recommend you go back to survivorsupport.net, to that website, survivorsupport.net, under the podcast tab, and you will now see the expanding series on forgiveness, the one that we're doing. That will give you context to bring you up to speed on where we are. We're jumping right back into a little bit of review for a moment or two, because we're going to continue to look at, are there categories of people that are beyond God's forgiveness so that we don't have to worry about, as I mentioned earlier, something such as this meme that says, I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. That is very ubiquitous in terms of the belief, that meme, both in secular and Christian counseling in churches. You will hear that time and time again, basically bury the hatchet, move on. Well, the real question is, what is God's perspective on that? And is it possible? And I'm not saying, is it possible, but we really still need to do it. For instance, we need to love God the way he should be loved and honored, but we don't have it within ourselves. So he actually gives us the ability, the power, and the desire to do that. Are we talking that kind of situation where I don't have it within me to forgive someone, but God needs to help me with that forgiveness? Now, in some cases that may be true, but generally speaking, there are certain categories of people, and we've looked at that. There are certain categories of people that are eligible for forgiveness and certain categories that are not. We've looked at the rubric, the general principle or premise, which is 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, then he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins, cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The key to forgiveness lies with us in this sense. If I have offended God, and we all have, then it is incumbent upon me to take the first move, meaning I have to confess. If I don't confess, does God forgive? No, he does not. Is that because he's an unforgiving God? No, he's not. It's because I'm not coming to him in truth. I'm not coming to him in brokenness and contrition. I'm not coming to him on his terms. I'm not confessing. I'm not saying the exact same thing about what I did, the impact it had on him. I'm not saying the same thing that God is. And so there's nothing to discuss because we're talking about two different things. He's talking about truth and reality. I'm skirting the issue. I'm justifying and rationalizing. It is the same thing with other people. If I have meaningfully and significantly negatively impacted someone, and if I give a cheap apology where I whitewash things, where I justify and rationalize, that can take the form of, well, I'm sorry for everything I ever did. Okay, that is not an apology. An apology is specific. An apology has goodness of fit. That's why in Matthew 5, Jesus said, if you're at the altar presenting your gift and you suddenly remember, I mean, you've been hard-hearted, hard-headed until now, you suddenly remember that you've been a jerk. What are you supposed to do? You leave your gift at the altar, meaning this person was still, in their mind, they were okay with God. And God broke through in church, no less, in a religious setting, service, and let the person know, no, you're not right with me. If you come from a Christian perspective, in a way, that's where each pastor should help someone understand they need to examine themselves, not just to ensure they're the real deal, that they are in God's family through 1 John 1:9, confessing, but am I right with my fellow man? Am I right with my brother, so to speak? That has to do with Matthew 5. Meaning, does somebody have something legitimate against me? If they do, then don't be religious anymore. I need to go and be real and what? And come to terms with, meaning to get real and discuss how I can make the person whole. The Jews were to add 20% on top of whatever the issue was, right? That's for pain and suffering. God's very serious about that. So to tell someone who has been on the receiving end of significant and meaningful negative impact that they should just bury the hatchet and move on without the perpetrator, without the oppressor confessing, that is a distortion of truth, it's a distortion of reality, and it's a distortion of God's heart. God's emphasis is on the perpetrator, the oppressor, the hurtful person, the pig, the dog, the fool, the reprobate, the sociopath, the psychopath, all these different terms that we've talked about. The responsibility lies on the hurtful person, the selfish person, not on the injured party. What's happening with the injured party? In Matthew 5, the injured party is actually going to the judge. God never criticizes the injured party for being immature, for being less than spiritual. In Revelation chapter 6, verse 10, the martyred saints are crying out day and night around the throne, right? And the angels are crying out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. But what do the martyred saints do? They actually are asking the Lord, how long, O Lord, before you avenge our blood? Oh, wait a second. The most spiritual individuals who now are in heaven, all things are being made new, the old is passing away. The things of earth, okay, they had their heads chopped off. Why are they still even worried about that? Because they know that injustice was perpetrated against them. Jesus never rebukes them. He never says, I can't believe it. You of all people, you're still hanging on to that. Well, let bygones be bygones. You're actually in heaven now. He tells them to sit tight. And then the next thing we see unfold is that coals are taken from the altar by big tongs, and judgment starts. God is very intent upon showing those who have been harmed that none of their pain ever fell upon deaf ears. So, with the issue of forgiveness, if you tell someone who was on the receiving end of significant evil, significant oppression, that they need to just move on, then you are giving them a distorted perspective of God's heart. God's heart is for justice. And that's where those of us that have not been harmed, or those of us that, and we all should be aware of it, and we will look at in the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, we're going to look at how Jesus separated out the two categories of people that he had a message for. He had a message for those that were being oppressed, basically a message of encouragement that God had not forgotten. And those that were being compelled by God's Spirit to intervene, to stop the oppression. And so he has a message of encouragement for those. And then, of course, he delivers the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. So we will look at that. But the premise is that there are categories of people that have gone so far in terms of their internal disposition that they can not only perpetrate evil without any sense of guilt, but they have moved beyond forgiveness. Why? Because they will never ask for forgiveness. Why? Because their hearts are too hardened. Why? Because they want to have hard hearts. Right? They've been given over. We looked at what is a reprobate mind. That is a metallurgy term. It's no longer good for its intended purpose. Our mind is intended for us to have a high value of people and a low value of things. We love people and use things. A reprobate mind has gotten off the straight and narrow, gone downhill, and eventually has become so saturated with self that it will never want to ever return. So therefore, they've gone past the point of no return. God's given them over, and they are a walking self. And therefore, they have a high view of things and a low view of people. We call that objectification. So they love things and use people. Those people are beyond hope. Now, do we really ever know by looking at someone? Probably not. We looked at Paul. Somebody would have thought, since he was the number one persecutor of the church, that Paul was beyond hope. But as we've learned and looked at, Paul was not beyond hope. Why? Because he perpetrated, right? What he did what was evil. But why did he do it? He did it out of ignorance. And we looked at the difference between categories of people. That is crucial. Because as we continue to look at the issue of forgiveness, we need to be able to free ourselves if you've been on the receiving end of significant hurt, somebody that was significantly hurtful. You need to be able to have encouragement to know that God knows and he understands and he sees. And that if someone is acting out of evil and they are an oppressor, that you can pray a certain kind of way, and we will be looking at imprecatory prayers. You can pray a certain kind of way that matches God's heart, that will move him to your side, that will move him to protect you. He already is moving in that direction, but he wants us to know that that's how much he cares about us. That is his kindness, his loving kindness, and his mercies will be shown to us, those that have been on the receiving end of oppression. That is different than persecution. And we looked at those last time. So the categories of people matter. Why? Because if someone has moved into a certain category, then we don't have to worry about whether or not we're forgiving them. Why? Because they will never ask for forgiveness. So we then are free to pour our hearts out to God, knowing that He will take up our cause. Last time we looked at some of these categories, and it is very important because we will continue to make the case that in the book of Psalms, the largest Old Testament book, which was given Jesus' stamp of approval, Jesus quoted more from the book of Psalms than any other book of the Bible. It is filled with imprecatory prayers. And my contention is that book was preserved for us, the Old Testament was preserved for us for our encouragement, for our instruction. If, in fact, that 46% of the book of Psalms are imprecatory prayers, which essentially say, God, you know what they're doing to me, get them. Well, either we have a schizophrenic situation going on in Scripture where we have the God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament, or God's heart is consistent and it has not changed. The survivor needs to know this because the teaching that has crept into Christianity, the teaching that's crept into churches, teaching that's crept into counseling, is really still that meme, that idea that you have to forgive someone no matter what, especially for survivors. Forgive and forget. Many churches are very prone to accepting back into their congregation or retaining someone who has perpetrated a sex offense, who has perpetrated upon a child, who has perpetrated upon another parishioner or someone in the congregation. Elder so-and-so perped on somebody in the congregation or a child. And replete our stories of survivors, of victims, having to sit there for not just days and weeks, but months and years, having to be in the same building as the perpetrator. And what's the message that is sent to the survivor? Forgive and forget. You need to put the past in the past. You need to move on. As a matter of fact, here's adding insult to injury. We need to practice extending the same forgiveness to the offender that the Lord extended to us. And I cannot tell you how distorted that message is. And it's very similar to what happens in domestic violence situations, where the message that is given to the injured spouse, in the majority of the times it's going to be the wife, is basically, you know what, just you need to put it behind you. If you can't, you're the one with the issue. That is such a grand lie. And it's based upon this distorted notion that God views all sins the same. Now, will all sins send people to hell? Of course. But there are degrees of impact, and we looked at that. Not all impact is the same. And deep within the human heart, we have a sense of this. And God wants survivors to know that He understands this. So we looked at the degrees of impact. We first looked at we created a scale of 1 to 10. And when somebody has been negatively impacted, the facts are found in the left brain. In one's left brain, right brain discerns the thoughts, the intentions of what was going on. Why did the person do what they did? And the degree of impact and the degree of willful disregard. And so the best way to understand impact is on a scale of 1 to 10. Trust me, as we've looked at before, the body keeps a score. A part of you will know the extent to which you've been impacted, and that we've looked at time and time again, the issue of knapsacks. You will know, a part of you will know, because those different knapsacks can be weighted, right? Somebody can say something negative versus do something negative, and it carries with it different weights. So we looked at the idea of when Jesus said, love your enemies. Again, what does that mean? Does that mean carte blanche, anybody doing something negative? And so we looked at, no, what it looked at, I'm sorry, I got a hold of myself. Let me go back to this. So here's that verse, just in review real fast. There are three different words that could have been selected in Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but Matthew translated into Greek. So Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, but I say, do not resist an evil person." Then he also said, "Love your enemies." And so we looked at what word, because if somebody's doing something negative to you, they are an enemy. But now the question is, what kind of enemy? Okay, and so there are a couple different words. We looked at poneros. Okay, so this kind of person would be categorized that Jesus was talking about was someone that is hurtful, but look at the underlined words down there. So somebody that is hurtful, perpetrating evil, but that difference from kakos and sapros, and we looked at those two words. Let me see if I can find it here. I do have it. So kakos. So paneros has to do with the effect, but kakos, look at that, inwardly rotten. Okay, inward malice. And then we have, I'll get the other one. Uh, sorry, right. Uh, wait, Sephiros. Where's Sephiros? There we go. There we go. Which is right there. Okay, rotten and putrid, unfit for its original use. So, by nature, when Jesus was saying to love your enemies, he's talking about a category of people that Paul would have fit in. Paul was doing hurtful things, but it was coming from a different heart condition. Paul was persecuting. And as we looked at last time, the best way to understand the idea of enemies is in two different categories. Okay, the first category Paul fell into, the Roman soldiers fell into, those that would be called paneros, that word for enemy. But sapros and kakos, that is different. Those are stemming from an evil heart. And it matters completely because when it comes to the premise that we need to forgive someone, it really depends upon the category they fall into, because God forgives those that are willing to confess, that have not gone too far. That's why Paul was eligible for forgiveness, though he did hurtful things. He said he was an enemy of the gospel. Again, here's the Greek word, just so you can see it. That's the word that Jesus used in the little red box there. So it's translated evil, but again, panero, so paneros. So in looking at the issue of who should we forgive, we should forgive those that confess. When there is confession, then there is forgiveness. 70 times 7. But if there is no confession, there is nothing to discuss because a person hasn't put that forward. The cry of the human heart that has been on the receiving end of hurtfulness is essentially, Lord, do you know? Do you see? Do you care? The question is, does our pain matter? Does your pain matter? If someone comes along and tells you, you know what, just let bygones be bygones, bury the hatchet, move on, past is in the past, a part of that message is telling you, or that message is telling a part of you, that your pain doesn't matter. Well, then the question is, to what extent can you trust God? To what extent is God really, truly concerned? And so then, if you are going through difficult things, and if you've been given the message that your pain really doesn't matter to God, how much are you inclined to pray? Probably not a lot. How much are you inclined to trust? Probably not a lot. Why? Because the message you're being given is that God essentially cares just as much about oppressors as those who are oppressed. And that is not true. God cares about the oppressed. What I tell people gentlemen, what I tell men that I work with that are justice involved, that have done very hurtful things, quite frankly, sex offenders, what I tell them is this: they are eligible for God's forgiveness, and his mercy and compassion, but when? When they confess. But what happens if they don't confess? Then they are not eligible for God's forgiveness. When they are starting with me, let's say they've just come out of prison, or while I was in prison working with these men, the category of men, the message I needed to deliver to them was the message of truth, which was they are under judgment. And they're under judgment because they have perpetrated. God's mercy and his kindness are toward those that they impacted. If the perpetrator ever wants to be eligible for forgiveness, he has to confess, and then he's eligible for God's mercy. But if he does not confess, then he's not eligible for God's mercy. Where is God's mercy? It is toward those that have been impacted, those that have been negatively impacted. If we give the message to a survivor of any kind of significant oppression, that they need to just forgive and move on, then we're giving them a distorted message about God's heart. God's heart is for the survivor. His heart is for those that have been oppressed. That is what will help them remain stable and fixed. Psalm 91:1. If we remain under the shadow of the Almighty, why are we going to remain under the shadow of the Almighty? Because we're going to remain on the path of life. Why are we going to do that? Why are we not going to rewrite Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your path. Why am I going to do that? I will only be able to trust the Lord with all my heart if I feel he can be trusted. And what's the one thing that a survivor needs to know? That their pain matters. Psalm 56:8 says that he's captured our tears in a bottle, a very important little pouch. No tear born out of pain has ever fallen on deaf ears. And that same word for tears is wanderings. And we've looked at that. That was the result of someone through oppression that had been driven from their home, and now they are an alien. The Jews were mandated to take care of widows, orphans, and aliens, those that had been on the receiving end of injustice. So God's heart is for the vulnerable. His heart is for those that have been negatively impacted. It is not it's not toward, for good, those that are perpetrating, those that are oppressive. That is the message that will help sustain someone that is going through very difficult things because of evil, because of oppression. That is what allowed David to stay stable and fixed. That is why 46% of the book of Psalms are filled with imprecatory prayers. That is why David references time and time again that he will sing of God's mercy and his kindness. He'll sing of God's character when God fulfills his promise to do what? We looked at that. That's at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, also the end of the book of Isaiah, where God makes a promise. Through Moses, God's last words to the Israelites were that he would avenge injustice. That was the promise that the Israelites could take to the bank. That is how they would know that God cared. That was the stabilizing factor. So therefore, they could trust in the Lord with all their heart. They didn't have to lean on their own understanding. In all their ways, they would acknowledge him, and he would direct their path. He would be surrounding them. That is the message that a survivor needs to know. To be able to help those of you that have been negatively impacted, or if there are some that are listening to me that have been hurtful but haven't taken this message seriously, I want to help you see the best way to understand these categories, so that if you happen to fall into one of these categories, and now I'm really going to be talking to a hurtful person, but if you have been injured by one of these, you will be able to take heart in knowing that God cares and that he's dealing with, he's working on that hurtful person. But there is a certain category beyond which certainly you should not be dealing with. And there is a category that will actually pursue you. And that is a category that will end up perpetrating great harm. And that comes out of Proverbs chapter 1, verses 22. God states there are three categories of people that if they do not wise up, that's my interpretation. If they do not wise up, if they do not turn it around, they will be heading for a world of hurt. Why? Because they will end up becoming hurtful and God will step in and God will judge them. And he wants these three categories of people to understand that they need to take seriously his heart of protection for those who would be hurt by these oppressors, by those that would hurt others. Matter of fact, we will save these categories for when we come back from the break. For those of you that have been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted by an oppressor, there's good news because I want to show you how deeply God cares about your pain. And we will look at that on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the leader in Internet TV, TECN.TV. We're picking up where we left off. We are looking at the categories of people that end up under God's judgment because they are hurtful to other people. A teaching has crept into the church, to churches, to Christianity. This same teaching, quite frankly, has crept into all of secular psychology that basically tries to, this term isn't too bad, sin leveling. Now, the best way to understand that is that all sin's the same and therefore it really doesn't matter and people need to learn to just bury the hatchet and move on. The responsibility has been shifted to survivors and those that have been oppressed, those that have been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted. The burden has been shifted to them. The focus has been that they need to be the ones to get over it. That is not what God says. What God says is it is the oppressor who better take this seriously. It is to the injured party that God says, I see, I know, I understand. And if the oppressor doesn't get with the program, become broken and contrite, and make amends in a way that genuinely demonstrates that the person gets it, and that matches, meaning the attempted amends are going to match the degree of impact, negative impact on you, then God takes it seriously. God supports the oppressed. He supports the victims. He does not support the oppressors. His message has always been that oppressors, hurtful people, are under his judgment, that he has drawn a bead. That's a hunting term. They are in his crosshairs. That is what is the most needed message by those that are being harmed, by those that are being oppressed. It has always been his message. His message of warning to the oppressor is the message of kindness, loving kindness and mercy to the oppressed. When Jesus said, love your enemies, he was not talking about oppressors. He was talking about those that persecute. If you've been on the receiving end of persecution, and we looked at this before, as a matter of fact, again, 46% of the book of Psalms has to do with oppression, not persecution. That's the level that we're talking about. Look at the top left. So the majority of the book of Psalms, we're talking significant issues. And we looked at those kind of rape, murder, incest, sexual perpetration, betrayal, done by white-collar psychopaths. So imprecatory prayers, 46% of the book of Psalms are for the 9s and 10s. Those are the issues that will significantly, meaningfully and significantly, in a negative way, change the course of your life. That is the key. This is not the small stuff. So God is very concerned that the message is sent to the perpetrator, that the perpetrator is in trouble. The oppressor is in real trouble. The victim has God as an ally. God is deeply concerned about the victim's pain, the survivor's pain. So the best way to understand who is or is not eligible for forgiveness is to understand this on a continuum and a gradation, the way I believe the Bible lays this out, so that we can understand how God feels about us and how God feels about the perpetrator or the oppressor. So I'm going to show you a chart that I use for, quite frankly, the men in my groups. I do sex offender treatment groups, and I want them to understand this biblical truth so that they're not playing mind games with themselves. Because by the time somebody sexually offends, they have a bad heart. Okay? They have lost all milk of human kindness, and nobody offends by accident. So there is an important message, as it were, that needs to be seen. So the importance of a biblical model toward to help with understanding the slippery slope toward dead psychopathy, and we've looked at some of that terms. Okay, the reprobate, the fool, the reprobate, the oppressor. Okay, psychology comes along and we finally call it psychopathy, but it really is on a continuum of scale of 1 to 10. So why is it important to see that there are categories and that beyond a certain point in this scale, that the survivor can take heart, that God will pick up and defend their right, defend and protect them. It's crucial so that they know that God's heart is toward them, not toward the oppressor. He views this very seriously. So a proper understanding helps us have perspective on the hardening of the heart process. So the hardening process is twisting effect on the on appetites as far as the perpetrator, meaning a lot of dynamic things happen as someone's going downhill. The perpetrator. The inversion of values. These are all things that are happening to a perpetrator as they go down. The objectification process, ensnaring and enveloping process, meaning this person that we're going to look at is the kind of person that ends up becoming the oppressor. And we need to see from God's perspective that they do not have God's perspective is not the same toward the oppressor versus the oppressed. God comes alongside the oppressed to comfort. How does he comfort them? To let them know the oppressor is not getting away with it, that God is taking it very seriously. A lot of things, again, are happening when somebody gets off the straight and narrow. They harmonize with evil, their mind becomes dark, there's a perversion process that starts, and they start to pursue evil. They harmonize with evil, and now they start to hunger and thirst after it. These are the kind of people we're talking about. So, no, not all sin is the same. This is where 46% of the book of Psalms come in. Now, the best way to understand this is twofold: to understand how God views this, and then how he feels about it. So the best way to understand oppression is on a scale of 1 to 10, or moving from the slippery slope, from the straight and narrow to down the slippery slope. So you can see as someone is on the straight and narrow, that God's presence and blessing is on that person. That's over on the top left. If a person gets off the straight and narrow, God doesn't zap them. God still has a lot of care and concern, but he's trying to get them where? Back up on the straight and narrow. Those are the inadvertent things that we all do. And then his loving corrective discipline. Again, this person, even in that third category right now, will be the kind of person that will still apologize, will not do things on purpose. But as they go downhill, as their ego is growing, God's character it shifts, right? The oppressive person, the hurtful person, their selfishness is increasing, and so they become eligible. As they go through these different categories, God will respond differently. Imprecatory prayers are for the far right, actually starting with his anger, moving to his wrath. So we need to pray in accordance with God's will, which is in accordance with his nature and his heart. And therefore, we pray differently depending upon what category somebody falls in, because the person that falls in what we're going to show you are these categories will be acting differently. In what way? Meaning the impact they're going to have on other people. So remember, the two categories that fall under enemy and evil are persecutors and oppressors. You see the O kind of starts where the N under persecution, because there's an overlap in this sense. This is ego that's starting to grow like a snowball. Paul said he was eligible for forgiveness. Why? Because he persecuted the church. He did what he did out of ignorance. So Paul was under God's rebuke, but Paul did not become an oppressor. That's why Paul was eligible for forgiveness, though he still was an enemy of the gospel and still did hurtful things. But the people that were on the receiving end of Paul's behavior understood that Paul was angry at truth, not trying to hurt them as people. There is an additional thing that happens the further someone goes down. There is a twisting effect, moral inversion. You notice that doesn't happen with someone that is a persecutor. And they become, this Romans chapter 1, they become judicially abandoned to a self-imposed, non-functioning, blinded, hardened, recalcitrant, and depraved mind. That kind of person is going to perpetrate a qualitatively different degree of hurt. That is why they are not eligible for forgiveness, because by the time they get down there, they will never want to come back. Now, what are some of the terms that God uses, that the Bible uses for this people that are going downhill like this? Now, my contention is this: these are different descriptors of different categories that place themselves under, they position themselves under different aspects of God's character. So we have the wise, then the young and the distracted. Distracted is not so much a biblical term. I threw in that term, but the majority of these are right out of the book of Psalms and Proverbs. We have the simple. You know, God's not judging the simple, but if they don't turn around, they become wayward. And then here it is, transgressor and willful. Now this is starting to be serious. The haughty, the mocker, That's the point right there. The contentious, these are all willful. The rebel, the fool. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. The proud, the brazen, the indifferent, the defiant. Look at, they're moving towards judgment. The perverse, the callous, the despiser of authority, the twisted, the malevolent, the wicked, the deceiver, the vile, the slanderer. That's important to know. The evil. By the way, a lot of people minimize slander. That is soul murder. What category, if you are a slanderer, what category are you under as far as what are you eligible to receive from God's character? You had better take this very seriously. If you slander people, I'm here to tell you, you are not a Christian. You have aligned yourself with evil. As a matter of fact, slander, the root word of it is diabolos. That's the devil. You speak with the devil's tongue. We need to take this seriously. Pastors need to take this seriously and send the message. So calculating the defiler and the sadistic. Sadistic is not in Scripture. Okay, now, the best way to understand that, so I've just laid out content for you, factual pieces of data to show that, and do your own study. Go back and watch this and see if I'm not correct. I don't want to be correct. I have to be correct, meaning it's important as I'm working with people. And what you're going to find is this. Each one of those terms, it's very consistent how God responds to each of those categories of people. So do your own word study. And what I tell the guys I work with or anybody else that's been hurtful is, what category of God's heart, his character, do you want to experience? And if you don't want to experience his destruction, then don't be in that category. Well, we looked at words on a white page for left brain effect. Let me describe why I just did that. Because those are facts. But God is not an indifferent God. God is a person. Now, that's different than saying he's like people, right? But God has a personality. We are made in his image. And the reason why we have emotions is because God has emotions. So it's not enough for us to see, okay, these are the categories. But what I really want us to see, and the men that I work with, quite frankly, and I show them this chart. This is the only chart that ever gets through to them if there's any hope, is I want them to see it's not just intellectual fact, but this is God's heart. And depending upon what aspect of God's emotions and his heart you want to fall under, then you get to choose. And so now we're going to add color. The same chart, but look what's coming through now. There we are. So how does God feel about certain people? It's not enough to say, well, of course it's enough. We could say, well, what does God think about these people? How about the idea of what does God feel? And then how does God feel about the people they are hurting? Because the one thing that's in common, the one thing that's being played out is as somebody moves from left to right, they end up doing what? They end up hurting someone else, right? They end up, as we've seen before, they end up being the person on the right with no knapsacks, and they are going down, they are downhill. In our little picture here, we may be dealing with an 8, -8, 9, or 10 person. So they are dumping on someone. So the person that is in this colored chart is the person on the right. They are actively hurting someone. So we have this picture. We're going to come back to this picture now. So the more the person dumps, the more the person negatively impacts. So we're going to look at the person on the right. The more they give themselves permission to continue to offload their responsibility. And how do you do that? You can give someone what they don't deserve, and you can withhold from someone what they do deserve. And you can continue to become increasingly oppressive. And how does God feel about that person? He feels this way on the person on the right. Well, how does God feel about the person on the left? Well, actually, in this picture, I'll tell you how he feels. He feels toward the person on the left the way he feels toward the woman giving dogs and pigs treats. So he actually doesn't want the person all heavy laden like that. But we're talking now about a little different situation. We're talking about the person on the right. But in this case, when we are looking at these charts, we are not to be around pigs and dogs and fools. So the premise is this: as we're looking at these different categories, that I'm not hanging around pigs and dogs and fools. I've actually moved away from them. I am now on the straight and narrow. I'm doing the right thing. I'm on the path of life. But somehow, somebody is going to begin to oppress me. I'm not inviting it. Okay, this person is inviting problems into her life. This person will feel eventually stressed. This person is accepting all these knapsacks. Okay, so don't be like that person, right? But in this concept of oppression, this is not me going along because I don't want to say anything. This is somebody actively targeting another person. And so when we're looking at, for instance, the men that I deal with that have sexually perpetrated, where do you think they are? They're over on the far right, I can tell you. Now, whereabouts? Well, and some could be right about in the middle, depending upon the category. There's about 8 categories of sex offenders, okay, as far as male sex offenders. But forget sexual perpetration. How about the mother Gothels in life? Remember the movie Tangled? So we have a female white-collar psychopath. We've looked at the sociopaths and psychopaths and their characteristics. I'm going to add now an additional layer as I have in the past. Again, think in terms of the persecutors and the oppressors, right? That you can get to a point where you have moved into significantly hurting someone. Why? Because you care more about yourself than someone else. I want people to understand that this is not just an Old Testament concept. And this is just not me reading into it, because I want to show you that as we are going to continue to look at the issue of forgiveness and the issue of imprecatory prayers, that this is a concept that was throughout Scripture. Jesus gave his stamp of approval to the Old Testament, to the book of Proverbs, to the book of Psalms, and that the message he was giving to his hearers was not a different message than what I'm going to share with you now. Okay, so as we will start to look at, again, imprecatory prayers and how Jesus didn't change his message, that his message wasn't allow perpetrators, and I'm not just talking about sexual perpetrators, allow them off easy, meaning let bygones be bygones, bury the hatchet. We need to understand that he wasn't changing the message. What he was talking about as far as loving one's enemies, the word enemy and evil was persecution. It wasn't the further categories to the right. Those are very different kinds of categories. And I want to read to you Proverbs chapter 1, verses 22. And it's very powerful because he's going to list, Solomon will, 3 categories of people that are heading for trouble. In what way? Not just natural consequences, but God stepping in. It says this, how long, you simpletons, will you insist on being simple-minded? How long will you mockers relish your mocking? And how long will you fools hate knowledge? And then I'm prefacing, it actually goes to the end of the chapter, verse 32, but for time constraints, he's saying this, to those 3 categories, how long are you going to continue to go downhill? Turn around, meaning seek me, turn around before it's too late, or I will mock you. I will laugh when calamity overtakes you. What, just natural consequences? No. divinely orchestrated judgment. And so in that passage, it lists 3 categories, and we will touch on this again next time. We'll develop it a little bit more, but I want you to see that the idea of categories and who someone falls in is very biblical. Jesus is not going to contradict himself. Here's what we have. So I've overlaid now on that same chart that you saw, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 22. And I've now added and circled the meaning of these different words in these categories. So we could say this: there are 3 categories with various subcategories that as the snowball builds, it will go from one to the other. And if a person doesn't turn around, the inertia of selfishness is going to send them where? Into the category of no return, because by that time they love evil more than good and they harmonize with it. So when he says, how long will you simpletons, the term for simple means ignorant, careless, naive, the unwary, and they're actually open to the other 2 categories. So they're open to evil, they're undiscerning and unguarded. So that's a warning to the simple, because they're not going to be hanging around with people that are over in the other 2 categories and not be impacted. So the Lord's sending a message to that category, right? They're going to be jammed up if they hang around with those kind of people. It's going to impact their characters. The bad apple does what? Spoiled the bunch. So you want these bunch of apples not to be simple. The next will be mocker. That category, you can see it's already moving. It's right close to the fool. But you look at the mocker, that also means straight down: the scorner, the scoffer, the arrogant, the despiser and rejecter of truth, to deride and to ridicule, and then the fool. So by the time somebody becomes a mocker, what are they on the receiving end of with God? He's already angry with them. So this is both the persecutor, but then the oppressor. There's a transition. So partway through, you can have persecution, but then ego picks up. But somebody can be an oppressor, by the way, with never having been a persecutor. And then it morphs into what? And the 2 terms that it references, and I'll just show you this. Here's some commentaries. So fool and evil. Okay, so a couple quick commentaries. We'll look at this next time. Ye simple ones, ignorant, easy, credulous, love simplicity, scorners, look right in the middle, that scoff at religion, and then the bottom, fools, willful and wicked. And then there's one other descriptor of these terms. So the simple literally means open or fatally open to evil. So they're going to be influenced. Then scorner is mocker at all good things. Still a little bit of hope for that person, but then look at the fools, in the sense of being hardened, obstinate, perverse, hating the knowledge they have rejected. Why is all this important? Because those are going to be the people that will perpetrate great harm. And those will be the people that God will come to the defense of those they oppress. So no, do not tell someone who's been on the receiving end of a fool, of someone who has been on the receiving end of an evil person, that they just need to bury the hatchet and move on. That is not what God says. And we will continue to look at how much God cares about the oppressed, what kind of judgment the oppressors are under, when we come back next time on Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, Jon Uhler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with Jon, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with Jon, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.